Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Jordan Center. I'm Ann Lounsbury, Chair of Department of Russian Slavic Studies here at NYU. I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce Professor Victoria Smolkina. Professor Smolkina's 2018 book, A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism, received honorable mention for the Wayne Buchinich Book Prize, honoring the most important contribution to Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies in any discipline of the humanities and social sciences. And the Russian translation was longlisted for the Alexander Putigovsky Literary Prize. Smolkin is currently at work on two projects: The Wall of Memory, Ukraine and the Impossibility of History, and The World of Tomorrow, Communism, Cosmism, and the Fate of Utopia. And today, Professor Smolkin's talk is entitled No Monument, Babyn Yar as Site of History, Memory, and Politics. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for the invitation to take part in this very, very impressive program that you run at Jordan Center. I'm a occasional participant virtually, and it's always been something that has been enriching. So I'm honored to be part of that, of the series. Thank you especially to Professor Lounsbury for the invitation and for bringing me here. So this talk comes out of my current book, which, or specifically one of my current books, but the one that is directly in front of me, which is A History of Kyiv's Wall of Memory. The Wall of Memory was part of an ambitious project to create a new Soviet way of death. And the story is of what happened when that project was built in a place that was layered with human remains and haunting memories. The story of the book begins in 1967, when Kyiv's municipal authorities were charged with building a crematorium and funerary memorial complex. And it ends in 1982, when the Ukrainian authorities liquidated, quote unquote, the aesthetic and ideological centerpiece of that complex, called the Wall of Memory. Sorry, am I? Okay, it was lagging a little bit. Situated in Baikova Cemetery, Kyiv's oldest and most prestigious necropolis, the Baikova Funerary Memorial Complex was intended as a secular socialist alternative to religion. Indeed, the complex, which involved a crematorium, the first one in Ukraine, was part of a project that the revolution had begun in 1917, but had yet to complete, creating an atheist society. This is the connection from my first book and kind of how I began working on this. By the 1960s, it had become clear that what kept people attached to religion were the rituals, and that death rituals were the most deeply rooted of the rituals that were studied by the Soviet ethnographers. So if Soviet communism was to overcome religion, it would have to provide its own ritual spaces and practices for death, sacred in form, but secular and Soviet in content. Kyiv's funerary memorial complex was the most ambitious part of this project. Now, as you'll see, today's talk, okay, there is a lag. Okay, I'll just get used to the lag. And as you will see, today's talk actually does not touch much on the project, on the actual subject of the book, which is this wall of memory directly. But it does help me answer the central question at the heart of the book, namely, why, after investing in its construction for over a decade, the Soviet authorities decide to destroy it. And the answer, as I hope to show today, has less to do with the object itself, the actual wall, which you see there in progress, but rather with the changing significance of the Jewish question in the Soviet Union in the post-war period, and more specifically of the state's attempt to manage Holocaust memory as the Holocaust itself emerged as an increasingly prominent element of international politics. So to turn to the story of today. On March 3rd, sorry, it's really, okay, there. Okay. On March 13th, 1961, when the reservoir dam at Babyn Yar broke, releasing a 25-foot wall of pulp made of sand, factory waste, and human remains into Kyiv's Kurynovka neighborhood, was an ordinary Monday. Residents of Kurynovka were leaving for work. They were dropping their children off at school. Kyivans from other parts of town made their way into the neighborhood to their jobs at the Krasny Tram Depot, the Pavlov Hospital, and the shoe factory. That winter had been especially brutal, and March had brought nothing but rain. And that day was particularly cold and overcast with a strong wind and wet snow. The dam broke at 8:30 in the morning, and the wave of pulp crashed into the neighborhood at the speed of 2 to 3 meters per second. It overturned cars and trees and swept up buses and trams carrying morning commuters. It flooded the tram depot and worker dorms, the shoe factory and school, the hospital, and the old Kabylov cemetery. It flooded the Spartak sports stadium and the first floors of multi-story residential apartment buildings, bringing down the old single-family houses that had remained from before the revolution. This industrial accident in the heart of Kyiv in 1961, the so-called Kurynovka flood, both literally and figuratively brought evidence of Babyn Yar back to the surface after 20 years of silence. The cultural and social reckoning that took place in its wake, most famously with Yevgeny Yevtushenko's poem Babyn Yar, quickly reached audiences on both sides of the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, the poem's opening line, which is of course quite famous, "No monument stands at Babyn Yar," unsettled a post-war status quo that had relegated the Jewish experience of the war beyond the pale of politics. And in the West, it forged new connections between Jewish communities across time and space. Now, today, Babyn Yar has come to be a symbol not just of the Holocaust on Soviet territory, but also of the Soviet politics of forgetting. So on the surface, this proposition that I'm trying to make here, that it became a powerful catalyst for political transformation, may not seem particularly revolutionary. And in fact, given the centrality of Babyn Yar now as a trope, as both a historical and memorial trope, the claim may even appear self-evident. Yet how a site of mass atrocity first disappeared from public memory and then reemerged to become a site of international politics is a story that I found merits a closer look. What brought about this change, and how did it become the symbol of the Holocaust by bullets? This talk follows the story of how Babyn Yar emerged in public life to become such a memorial trope, how it in turn became a catalyst for social mobilization, and how what happened, and perhaps more importantly, what did not happen at Babyn Yar, made its way across Cold War borders. In short, it tells the story of how Babyn Yar acquired political meaning. To tell this story, I follow how Babyn Yar became the subject of KGB operations in the late Soviet period, operations that both reflected and produced reality. And I draw on the archives of the Soviet security apparatus to explore how the KGB's efforts to manage Babyn Yar in turn shaped the decisions and the strategies of the various actors involved. But alongside this historical question, I'm also interested in a methodological question that's actually only really been possible to think about since 2015, when the archives, the KGB archives in Ukraine, were opened. And now we have this kind of critical mass of scholarship where we can think about more substantively how to work with these sources. And so for me, the question that I was thinking about as I worked on this is what makes these sources distinct from, for example, sources generated by the party or by the state, the other kind of pillars of Soviet power, which are much more familiar to us as historians. And what new questions do they invite and new insights do they allow? And what I propose is that these sources provide a view of Soviet society that is distinct from official sources, namely institutional archives, the press, official publications, which in the Soviet context largely tell a story that the state wants to hear. But they also provide a view of society that is distinct from unofficial sources, from samizdat, from tamizdat, and especially from ego documents, memoirs, diaries, and so on, which often tell us more about how subjects want to see themselves than they do about the society around them. And in the Soviet context more broadly, what I'm thinking is that the security apparatus functions as a mediator between official truth and popular memory, between the narratives that the state sought to bring into existence and the narratives it sought to rewrite or erase. So to put it differently, I see the KGB archive as an archive of silences. To return to the Kurinovka tragedy with which I opened the talk, the Soviet authorities' immediate reaction to the flood, which was variously referred to as accident, catastrophe, natural disaster, and only later as tragedy, was silence. In the days that followed, there were no communications with the city's residents about the causes or the consequences of the breach in the dam. Even the death toll went unmentioned. By March 16th, 3 days after the event, when Kyivans heard a radio announcement which told them that, quote, part of the Kurinovka district was damaged as a result of the sudden slippage of soil and penetration of water from the Sirets ravine, they had almost certainly already heard about what had happened in Kurinovka from witnesses or through word of mouth. But for Soviet authorities, what was even more alarming than news about Kurinovka spreading through the city were the rumblings that some Kyivans were actually hearing about it on the BBC and Radio Liberty, especially since these illegal foreign outlets put the death toll closer to 1,500 to 2,000, as opposed to the 53 dead and 159 injured that were given as the official numbers in the first announcement. By March 20th, Kyiv Radio put the number of dead at 72. Soon after, the number climbs to 125. And although it was actually too soon to know the real number of casualties, even in Kyiv, because they were still kind of excavating the site, official silence created an information vacuum in which the death toll, along with everything else, became the subject of speculation and rumor. But official silence should not be mistaken for a lack of information. Immediately after the accident, Soviet authorities formed committees and gathered evidence on the causes of the flood and on the scope of the devastation. But they also instructed KGB organs to pay close attention to the, quote, mood of the inhabitants of Kyiv after the catastrophe of Babyn Yar. And informants throughout the city, serving as the KGB's eyes and ears, reported on rumors circulating through Kyiv about what happened and who was to blame. Beginning on March 14th and continuing for several weeks, the KGB compiled daily reports on the social fallout of the flood, relaying what Kyivans shared with friends and with family at home, with colleagues at work, and even strangers on the bus stop. The KGB also followed the flow of information out of the city, tracking letters and phone calls from Kyiv to other parts of the Soviet Union, and more disturbingly, abroad. It reported that there were 17 foreigners from capitalist country in Kyiv at the time of the event, and more worrisome still, that the city was anticipating the arrival of a 100-person American jazz orchestra. The KGB also intercepted letters on their way out of Kyiv, including one that painted an especially grim picture. It described, quote, homes, hospitals, kindergartens, daycares, the church, factories, and all the main institutions covered by water mixed with earth, along with all the people, the children, and the sick, overturned trolley buses, a tram that was dug out of the dirt with 198 dead. Everyone in the houses was dead, it concluded. It's impossible to describe. They say it was a hydrogen bomb. The KGB assured the party that the organs paid particular attention to, quote, preventing the leaking of information about the catastrophe abroad, in part through foreigners, and that it was employing all necessary measures to, quote, expose individuals who were trying to use this fact for purposes of anti-Soviet provocation. It quickly became clear, however, that trying to contain the fallout and control the flow of information within as well as in and out of the city posed very serious challenges. Over the next weeks, as local authorities and the press offered their own accounts of what happened, the KGB continued to record stories and explanations that Kyivans shared with each other in contexts they likely thought to be out of the earshot of the state. Now, these records offer a window into social concerns, contexts, and memories through which Kyivans made sense of what happened and of who or what was to blame. They show that Kyivans were not subtle in making the connection between the failures of Kyiv's authorities and the defects of the Soviet system in general, the corruption produced by political patronage, indifference to the well-being of ordinary people, and an unwillingness to report the truth. But it also shows that of the numerous varied issues that the KGB registered after the flood, the memory of Babyn Yar itself rose to the top. On March 15th, the city's main newspaper, Evening Kyiv, published an announcement that instructed people to avoid drinking from the city's water system. Immediately after, rumors spread through the city that the reason for the announcement was that the water had been contaminated by putrefied corpses at the site. A KGB report noted, quote, many individuals of Jewish nationality continued to express indignation about construction work at Babyn Yar, where in the occupation period, a large number of Jews died, close quote. One of the leaders of Kyiv's Jewish community was reported as saying that the catastrophe was, quote, the rising of the corpses of Jews shot by the Germans during the period of Kyiv's occupation. Other quote unquote individuals of Jewish nationality overheard at the site that the dead could no longer stand it, and that rather than filling the ravine, a memorial to the victims should have been built at Babyn Yar. Now, for the KGB, the invocation of Babyn Yar to explain the Kurilovka flood was troubling. It was especially worrisome because that association was not, in fact, the association of what was, in fact, an industrial accident with the desecration of a site of Nazi atrocity was not relegated only to so-called individuals of Jewish nationality. In numerous KGB accounts, Kyivans described the accident as retribution. One person in the crowd of onlookers gathered in Kurilovka had exclaimed, quote, the memory of those who died at Babyn Yar should not have been desecrated. This is why the disaster happened. Another, a local French teacher, said, this happened because people were digging around in there looking for gold teeth and rings. This is what everyone is saying. A poet asked, why was this reservoir, this chalice of death, even created? And a writer by the name of Shemilo called Kurilovka a second Babyn Yar. Many saw the flood as retribution, not just for the desecration of the site, but for a broader failure to remember, for the sin of silence. Indeed, their comments coalesced into a moral anxiety, not just about the state's refusal to call things by their name, but of society's complicity in the politics of forgetting. In this regard, the words of one journalist recounted in a KGB report are revealing. Quote, already 8 years ago, when I was still interning at Pravda Ukraine, I came to the editor and wanted to file a report that they were beginning to fill Babyn Yar. And he yelled at me and told me that this cannot be written about because God forbid, and yet Edinburgh will read it. And then there will be a scandal. Another unknown citizen, overheard near the morgue shortly after the flood, was reported as saying, we kept pouring waste and mud on Jewish bones. There will be an international scandal. Relatives in Israel and Poland will be informed. It will reach the United Nations. Indeed, it was this anxiety about a potential quote unquote scandal that became the refrain in the KGB's own analysis. The KGB, of course, was not so much concerned with the moral side of the question, but with the political fallout. While Kyivans made sense of the flood by placing retribution and atonement at the center, the KGB worried about information finding its way abroad, and especially the prospect of it reaching a Jewish audience. After 20 years of silence, the Kurilovka flood had brought Babyn Yar to the surface. So what would happen now that Babyn Yar, both the site itself and the memories it had unearthed, was again exposed? The first account of Babyn Yar appeared in the Soviet Union itself. On November 19th, 1941, 6 weeks after the massacre, the Soviet state newspaper Izvestia reported that information had been obtained that in Kyiv, the Germans had executed 52,000 Jews, men, women, and children. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov also sent word to the Allies repeatedly throughout early 1942, and his earliest note from January 6, which explicitly mentioned Jewish victims, was also published in Pravda. In 1945, Soviet officials in Ukraine commissioned an architect to design a monument commemorating Babyn Yar and even allocated 1.4 million rubles for construction. Described as a monument to the victims of German barbarians, it was to depict a white marble bas-relief of a mother holding a murdered child in her hands. Not long after, however, the project was quietly abandoned under the explicit instructions of then head of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. The scale of Kyiv's wartime destruction and consequently its post-war reconstruction was among the most extensive in the USSR. After the war, Soviet authorities in Kyiv sought to rebuild the socialist project and Soviet people's faith in it on the ruins of this devastation. The development projects undertaken in Kyiv in the 1950s were both intensive and extensive, with new districts appearing on the edges of the city almost overnight. Among these new constructions were new housing projects in Syrets, the neighborhood adjacent to Kurinovka. Indeed, the industrial waste that filled Babyn Yar came from the Petrov factories, which prepared the bricks for the construction of communism, or more specifically for the construction of housing for communism's builders. In this sense, when Kyiv's municipal authorities passed a resolution on March 28th, 1950, to turn the ravine into a reservoir for factory waste, it was really framed as a matter of city planning. As the brickyards worked around the clock to supply ambitious construction projects, running factory waste into Babyn Yar was just simply deemed the most rational and efficient solution. But turning Babyn Yar into a reservoir for factory waste also solved another problem, obliterating the traces of what had happened on the site 20 years earlier by expunging it from the very topography of the city. By the 1960s, the areas around Babyn Yar, Lukyanovka, Syrets, Kurinovka had become busy residential neighborhoods with little left to remind one of what had happened there in the recent past. And I just give this sign, this quite famous image. It's a sign that was on the site in the 1950s that just said the dumping of earth and garbage is prohibited, and there's a fine for 300 rubles. And this became kind of one of issues that people returned to later when they spoke about it. On April 1st, 1961, a few weeks after the Kurinovka disaster, the New York Times published an article, Soviet Bear's death of 145 in mudslide. So that's kind of an unfortunate title, actually. Recounting a quote-unquote mudslide that had been caused by, quote, huge mistakes in the work of a reclamation project to fill the Babyn Yar ravine. The article made no mention of Babyn Yar's history or of its significance. Before the article about the Kurinovka mudslide, Babyn Yar had actually barely appeared in US newspapers. The first time it appeared was on November 29th, 1943, following a visit to the site by Western journalists on the way of the city's liberation. And that really was part of an effort to kind of get the Allies to join in and to actually enter the war. In the article that was published in 1943 by W.H. Lawrence, he reported, not without skepticism, that the reported murder of 50 to 80,000 Jews, based on a story shared by three Russian soldiers who, as prisoners of war, had been forced to build makeshift crematoria to burn the bodies of the victims before the Germans retreated. The second time that Babyn Yar came up before 1961 was in September of 1955 in a translation of comments made by the Soviet Premier Bulganin to the Chancellor of West Germany, it kind of as a side context about prisoner exchanges with the Soviet Union. So while in retrospect, it may seem like a jarring omission that the 1961 article about the mudslide didn't mention about what actually had happened at the site, it reflects not just the absence of Babyn Yar in public consciousness, but really a broader lack of Western understanding at the time about the Holocaust on Soviet territory. Soon after, however, two events facilitated a fundamental change in this post-war status quo. The first was the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann. The trial, which began in Jerusalem on April 10th, 1961, so almost immediately after this event, transformed the broader understanding of the fate of Europe's Jewish population during the war by shifting the focus from a largely depersonalized legal framework of crimes against humanity to the experiences of witnesses and victims. The genocide of European Jewry, what has come to be described as the Holocaust, was transformed into a distinct story within the broader history of the Second World War. With the Eichmann trial, Holocaust consciousness also began to reach into the socialist orbit, but there its impact was more limited and distinct. In the USSR, the official narrative of the Eichmann trial was really shaped by Cold War interests, which prioritized the ideological conflict with West Germany over its failure to adequately deal with Nazi perpetrators over the concerns with Nazism's victims. The second event that pushed against the post-war status quo in the USSR was, of course, Yevtushenko's poem Babyn Yar. In August of 1961, so a few months after Kurylovka, Yevtushenko was in Kyiv for an upcoming poetry reading and was taken to Babyn Yar by Anatoly Kuznetsov, a young writer who had been a student at Gorky Institute of Literature in Moscow with him, and who had himself grown up in the Kurylovka neighborhood and lived there through the German occupation, as he then went on to relay in his famous novel and documents, or documentary novel. Later that same night, Yevtushenko composed the poem after seeing the site that began with the line, "No monument stands at Babyn Yar." In the days that followed, he read the poem multiple times to a packed hall at Kyiv's October Palace, and in an uncharacteristically fast editorial process, Babyn Yar was published in Literaturna Gazeta on September 19th, 1961, appearing on the last page next to two kind of ideologically correct poems about Cuba. The public reading of the poem and its publication in an official Soviet periodical marked the emergence of Babyn Yar from the realm of whispered local memory and KGB surveillance reports into Soviet public life. But Yevtushenko's poem also landed in a context in which a generational shift was already underway. In the USSR, a new generation was beginning to reckon with the wartime memory of Jewish experience. And for them, the simple fact that the story of Babyn Yar had become speakable in public emboldened them to mobilize around issues of historical memory and cultural and political rights. One representative of this new generation, Emmanuel, also known as Amit Diamant, a promising young engineer and amateur Yiddish poet who went on to become a dedicated Jewish activist in Kyiv, later recalled that attending that performance in Kyiv was a personal turning point for him. Quote, Yevtushenko in his poem woke in me the understanding that responsibility for everything that is going on in me and around me, with Babyn Yar, with the Jewish people, with my own Jewishness, and with everything that in one way or another is tied with these things, this was now my responsibility. Not someone else, somewhere else, but me, possibly the last Jew on this earth who still cares about these things. The encounter with Babyn Yar, Diamant recalled, moved him to action, but it also made him aware that the avenues into which he could channel such action simply just did not exist. What could be done, he asked. What should be done? I had no answer. The only thing he could think to do right then and there in Kyiv in August of 1961 was grab his camera and head to Babyn Yar, which is what he did, and made these are some of the first images that connect what happened to Babyn Yar at Babyn Yar with the Kurylovka tragedy. And he actually in his own archive, and he talks about this image, he calls it his own socialist realism, because he kind of stages the bones, right, to kind of make the point. So I just wanted to make that clear that it wasn't like found in that way. So the party's response to Yevtushenko's poem was predictable. Among the first to comment was Khrushchev's protege and the party's chief ideologist, Leonid Ilyich, who criticized the poem for, quote, vitalizing the unhealthy sentiments around the Jewish question in our country, which is widely used by bourgeois propaganda for purposes of defamation. Yet Ilyichov's concern about the resonance of the poem in bourgeois propaganda was not, in fact, misplaced. On September 28th, just 2 weeks after the publication of the poem in the Soviet Union, the New York Times ran a story about the controversy it had caused in the USSR, titled "Popular Poet is Accused of Slandering Russians by Hint that Bigotry Continues in the Soviet Union." And in it, the journalist Harry Schwartz introduced the poet to an American audience, but it's also telling that before discussing either the poet or the poem itself, he had to explain actually what Babyn Yar was, the history of it, the meaning of it, to an American audience for whom it did not have that kind of immediate recognition. Yevtushenko's stature abroad soared and quickly. In an October 2nd article, the New York Times already described him as the voice of Russia's conscience, who speaks for a new Soviet generation. And within 5 years, by 1966, there were 74 articles on Babyn Yar that would appear in 6 of the country's major newspapers. So over the course of the next few years, the new Holocaust consciousness also began to make connections between the genocide of European Jewry and the current situation of the Soviet Union's Jewish population, which in 1961 numbered 2.5 million, making it actually the 2nd largest Jewish population after the US. It also inspired a movement to save Soviet Jewry. This movement has been written about really well, and I'm happy to say more about it. But this movement, what's interesting for our purposes is it sought to rectify both the injustice of the USSR's treatment of its Jewish population and the guilt over the Jewish diaspora's inadequate response to the plight of European Jewry during the war. In the summer of 1966, the Central Conference of American Rabbis carried out an Eastern European mission to explore the condition of Soviet Jews. And as the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported, on July 27, 1966, 22 American rabbis, the largest group ever assembled in the Soviet Union, visited Babyn Yar to hold a memorial for the victims. There was not a memorial there. The rabbis prayed, quote, that Soviet authorities will erect a memorial to the approximately 100,000 Jews murdered there by the Germans in World War II, and they recited Yevtushenko's Babyn Yar at the site. Rabbi Jacob Weinstein said a prayer that the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reproduced in full. Quote, we stand here on hallowed ground where many thousands of our brethren lie buried in a musty pit. We cannot separate their commingled bones. But we can perform an act of poetic justice. We can insist on a special memorial for those who were so singularly selected for this bitter martyrdom. This article made sure to note that no Soviet citizens attended the memorial service. Also in 1966, Elie Wiesel published The Jews of Silence, and he then was actually basically unknown, and he would go on to become quite famous, but this was one of his first major political interventions. And it was an account of his own trip to the USSR in the fall of 1965. And the chapter he devoted to Babyn Yar can be seen as the crystallization of a narrative that had been forming in the West since 1961. Kyiv brings to mind Babyn Yar. Kyiv is Babyn Yar. Not that Kyiv is not beautiful, it is enchanting. But for the Jewish tourist, there's only one point of interest in the capital city of Ukraine, an attraction missing on the map and excluded from guided tours, Babyn Yar. In this narrative, Babyn Yar had come to symbolize both the Soviet silence around the history of the Holocaust and the state's continued repression of its Jewish population, as well as the responsibility of the Jewish diaspora to save that community, that last community of European Jewry living under a new totalitarian regime. By the end of the 1960s, then, the KGB found itself trying to manage and contain the memory of Babyn Yar and the threat of Jewish nationalism in fundamentally new conditions. A site that before 1961 had been little more than a space for storing industrial waste had been transformed into a place, and not just a place, but the place that should have a monument or memorial. Indeed, the fact that it had no monument inspired a broad social mobilization that culminated in the first mass commemoration of Babyn Yar in September of 1966 on the 25th anniversary of the massacre. According to the KGB's informational report of that first mass event, the meeting was attended by around 500, quote, citizens of Jewish nationality gathered in the neighborhood, and I love this part, they say, of the former Babyn Yar. Vitaly Nikitchenko, chairman of the Ukrainian KGB, described how around 5 p.m. people began to gather at the site, and after standing around and waiting for the arrival of official representatives who didn't come, began to give speeches that expressed discontent about a broad range of issues that included, quote, the fact that no officials showed up at the gathering, the lack of measures for the construction of a memorial, and the supposed existence of anti-Semitism in the country, which is evident in the unequal position of Jews in relation to other nationalities, the lack of Jewish schools, theaters, press, and so forth. Nikitschko took particular note of the participation in the meeting of prominent non-Jewish cultural figures. The writers Viktor Nekrasov, the Ukrainian writer Ivan Zuba, and Boris Antonenko Davidovich, who focused their remarks on the necessity, this is the KGB's quote, the necessity of battling anti-Semitism, as well as uniting the efforts of the Ukrainian and Jewish people, and the preservation of one's national culture. These speeches, the report noted, were positively received by the participants, and the report concluded by drawing attention to the significant amount of young people present at the event, and noted that quote unquote Jewish youth expressed their nationalist position in an especially turbulent manner. Now, that a mass gathering at Babyn Yar, especially one that brought together hundreds of people of different social and ethnic backgrounds, got the attention of the Soviet authorities is of course not surprising, but it is worth noting that September 29th was actually the second meeting that had been held at the site. 5 days prior, on September 24th, the eve of Yom Kippur, a group of young Jewish activists, including Diamant, who I mentioned earlier, organized a meeting to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Babyn Yar. And it's interesting because that September 24th event is actually not mentioned in the KGB report, even though Diamant mentions the presence of the KGB. But to me, what's most noteworthy about this first meeting, and these are images from his own archive, that's him. What's noteworthy about that first meeting is that it had no script. As he recalls, quote, people gathered, trolleybusters are rushing by along the road, people are staring at us from there, reading the wall inscription, and nothing else. Time is passing by, we don't know what to do next. We didn't think it through, and improvising on the spot is both unwise and inappropriate. But how exactly should one commemorate the dead of Babyn Yar? In the Soviet Union, of course, there were no scripts, so no official narratives or ceremonies for this type of occasions. So as those who gathered there stood in groups, 2 cars pulled up and people with film equipment, the KGB, got out filming those present. And as most people began to disperse to avoid their cameras, Diamant found himself face to face with one of the USSR's most famous living writers, Viktor Nekrasov. Nekrasov gave Diamant his number and left, and everyone dispersed. When Diamant met Nekrasov the following day, they agreed to organize another meeting to be held on September 29th, the anniversary of Babyn Yar itself. But reflecting on the silence and disorientation that had characterized the first meeting, this is a quote, the sad experience of our silence standing around, Nekrasov proposed that the meeting needed a center, that would structure the event and give it the appropriate solemnity. He called the Ukrainian writer Ivan Zuba and told him to come to his apartment on the morning of September 29th. And as Zuba later recalls in his own memoirs, he guessed what it may be about since the date was, quote, a special day in the lives of many Kyivans. At the memorial meeting, Zuba also described a demanding and questioning silence among the people present. Quote, people wanted to listen, to hear something important, but from whom? And when word started spreading that the writers have come, they surrounded us in a crowd and they demanded, say something. So Zuba, this is the second one. So you have Nekrasov here and Zuba's there. Zuba improvised, addressing the Jewish people on behalf of the Ukrainian people and calling Babyn Yar their shared tragedy. And there's a really excellent scholarship that looks at Zuba's speech, which I will say more about. But for me, what's interesting here is the KGB's reading of Zuba's speech, because it was decidedly more cynical. In its report, it noted that Kyiv's creative intelligentsia interpreted his speech as a, quote, call for the unification of two oppressed nations, Jews and Ukrainians, in the battle for their rights, unquote. But the report also shared an account, which it kind of presented as a reassurance, from an unnamed informant in the Institute of Literature, who reported that others actually expressed doubts about the prospect of Jewish-Ukrainian solidarity. And this is a quote. This is a quote that I wanted to give some attention to. Such a unification is not in the tradition of the Ukrainian people and is unlikely to bring positive results. It seems that Zuba is trying to use Jews because they have a loud voice in America and would be able to strengthen their positions in the international forum in case of contact with Ukrainians. They say that in the UN in the near future, the question of the colonial situation of Ukraine, of national discrimination of Ukrainians is going to be raised. And it's possible that this is the reason Zuba spoke at the meeting, in order to figure in foreign reports, and such a report on the meeting is not out of the question. In the KGB's reading then, Zuba's speech was not an improvised but deeply felt message inspired by the occasion, but a kind of instrumental use of one group's supposed sympathies abroad in order to attract attention to the plight of another group, namely his own group. The framing, however, does reveal the KGB's perception increasingly that Babyn Yar and the Soviet Union's Jewish question constituted some kind of political capital that could convert a Holocaust commemoration in Kyiv into an agenda item at the United Nations. There's no record of a meeting taking place in September 1967, the year following the first commemoration. And it's possible that the 66 meeting initially was not meant to be an annual event of that kind. It's also possible that plans for the meeting at Babyn Yar were overtaken by events, most significantly the Sinai or Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt, and between June 5th and 10th, 1967. And the war, as of course many people know, is a turning point which on the one hand led the USSR to quickly sever diplomatic relations with Israel, and on the other led to a kind of a reawakening or reconfirmation of Jewish identity in the USSR. That the Soviet state amplified anti-Zionist propaganda, depicting Israel as a colonial aggressor, and even likening Zionism to Nazism at the United Nations, intensified this opposition. Indeed, it produced the USSR's first international anti-Zionist political event, the trial of Boris Kyiv, a young Jewish radio engineer in Kyiv. Radicalized by Soviet anti-Zionism, he did something radical. He openly and publicly opposed the official version of events. He also applied for a visa to emigrate to Israel. In 1968, Kyiv was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 3 years in hard labor, becoming the first so-called prisoner of Zion. In this way, Kyiv, who before 67 had only a vague understanding of his own Jewish identity, became a public figure, first in Kyiv, then in the Soviet Union, and then finally abroad. And here in the show, this is on the left is a kind of a flyer of a student group to save Soviet Jewry. And it's called Boris Kyiv, Jew, and it kind of cites his, or it kind of quotes his poem. And the second is a very interesting text from 1971, a collection of texts about Boris Kyiv called A Hero for Our Time, which is edited by a very interesting figure named Moshe Dekter, who I can say a little bit more about. The KGB's plans, analysis of activist plans for 1968 point to the organization's awareness that that Soviet society was itself becoming increasingly politicized. Based on information gathered through KGB surveillance, Jewish Kyivans reportedly looked forward to the upcoming commemoration of Babyn Yar with confidence. One doctor was recorded as saying, quote, "In 2 to 3 years, the situation in our country will change. We will have our own dupchiks, and the initiative for this movement will come from the Jewish youth." For this doctor, those who had gathered at Babyn Yar in 1966, quote, showed that we, Jews, are a force to be reckoned with. After all, the whole world had found out about the meeting. The upcoming anniversary was an opportunity then to showcase the growing strength of the movement. And the KGB depicted a world in which Jewish activists were emboldened by this perceived, by the kind of political developments taking place abroad, namely the Prague Spring, but also by the perception that they had this American audience who was going to care about what they did. Of course, this confidence and optimism turned out to be short-lived because on August 21st, 1968, the Soviet army invades Czechoslovakia and it crushes the Prague Spring. In the Soviet Union itself, more political repressions follow, but for Jewish activists in Kyiv, the pessimism that followed the state's repression of the Prague Spring was also accompanied by a growing sense of their own marginalization and alienation from Soviet society. Increasingly, they found themselves in a position with little to lose. So by 1969, they're aware of the political capital that comes with attention abroad. And the mood around that year's anniversary was even more politically charged. The specifically Jewish identity of Babyn Yar becomes more pronounced and the use of Jewish themes and Zionist symbols more bold and deliberate. In advance of the 1969 meeting, the KGB notified the party that nationalist elements in Kyiv planned to, quote, give the meeting a Zionist character. The day before the meeting, the KGB also reported intercepting 175 pieces of mail addressed to individuals of Jewish nationality that included an abbreviated version of Yevtushenko's Babyn Yar and an insert that reminded them that thousands of your brothers and sisters were savagely annihilated and exhorted them to be vigilant. Later in its report on the memorial meeting itself, the KGB noted that these same flyers were found in the brush at the meeting, and it also registered the presence of 100 to 200 Jewish youth gathered at the memorial stone and Jewish nationalists who were, quote, well known to the KGB, who brought a wreath in the form of a six-corner star made of blue and white flowers, and this is a photo from their surveillance files. Some people in attendance lit candles. So this is, these photos are from the activist side. So it shows their account of things. Ultimately, the KGB reported after the active intervention of members of the public and the police, the candles were extinguished and the six-corner star was driven away from the neighborhood of Babyn Yar. So by the end of the 1960s, we see that the individuals who feature in these KGB reports are no longer simply objects of surveillance, but political subjects whose actions are deliberate communications with two specific audiences. Soviet power by way of the KGB, they're very aware that they're being watched and they're doing things to kind of provoke and to communicate. And they're activists and supporters abroad, often by way of foreigners inside the USSR, tourists, journalists, embassy officials. The Jewish activists became bolder, connecting the commemoration of Babyn Yar to Zionism, to Jewish rights, and of course, most importantly, to the right to emigrate. Now, we can't, I'm wrapping up and I can't speak about the 1970s. And I wanted to give just a sneak preview of the kinds of documents that the 1970s produce in KGB files. So first, but before that, I just want to say that all ended well for Boris Kaczynski. He did emigrate from the USSR in 1971, and there he is having, you know, a robust and happy life in Israel. So. Okay, and just if you can remember the images from the Soviet period, there's a striking difference. But over the course of the 1970s, as the issue of immigration becomes much more politicized, and Babyn Yar continues to be the place where people gather to kind of contest and make these political statements and claims, the KGB is also intercepting all sorts of mail and kind of objects that are being passed across the border. And this one, and these range, right? These are coming from Israel. And this one, you know, it's got this kind of pathos because it's, you know, Дорогие бабушка и дедушка, поздравляю вас с Новым годом. It's just like kind of grandchildren sending, Happy New Year, and they're like, this is Zionist propaganda, right? So we got to confiscate it. So poor, бабушка и дедушка never got this sweet card, which is very sad. But on the other hand, they were sending things that were in fact provocative. So kind of this picture of this young Israeli female soldier kind of saying, look at us. And поздравляю вас с Новым годом, so we hope to see you next year in Israel, right? So they're kind of like now communicating with a lot more deliberately. So I'll finish up with this. The efforts of Soviet security organs to contain and control Babyn Yar turned it into a political stage where different actors, Jewish activists, cultural figures, artists, and state officials on one side, and foreign tourists, religious and cultural figures, social activists, and politicians on the other, in the West, battled over the meaning and memory of Babyn Yar, the Holocaust, and the status of Soviet Jews in front of an increasingly international audience. Over the course of 20 years, events in Kyiv's Babyn Yar intersected with an emerging Holocaust consciousness, the movement to save Soviet Jewry abroad, and the call for Jewish emigration among Soviet dissidents. And as a result, Babyn Yar was transformed from a kind of non-place into the international symbol of Soviet repression of Holocaust memory, which linked the history of the Holocaust on Soviet territory with the contemporary plight of Soviet. So in this sense, we can look at the materials produced by the KGB as a kind of forensic ethnography that allows us to consider how the KGB, through these interactions, in effect kind of constructed these social meanings, which then in turn became new political realities. Over the course of the late Soviet period, as grassroots initiatives coalesced into a movement, the KGB monitored these efforts to try to control the public narrative of Babyn Yar, both at home and abroad. And in these new conditions, the security apparatus had to make new calculations about the relative costs and benefits of its methods for dealing with various threats it identified in what it perceived to be areas of vulnerability for Soviet power, the repression of dissident activism at home, and the pressure of international public opinion abroad. The resulting clash between a growing movement of activists mobilized by the West's attention to their plight and an increasingly defensive and conservative Soviet regime played out at Babyn Yar. So what began as an effort of local Holocaust commemoration consolidated into a political movement that reframed the cultural and religious rights of Soviet Jews, increasingly included the right to emigrate, and became a human rights issue that was legible in the context of Cold War politics. Thank you.
Gloria, thank you for that fascinating and incredibly rich talk. I'm going to let you take questions from the room, and then Sasha will help us take any questions from Zoom. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm the one taking the questions, it's me. Okay, Anne, please.
Well, I'll just get us started with the service one. Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. There's so many different dimensions to it. I'm really excited about the progression of this work.
Thanks so much.
Really sort of softball question here, but just you piqued my curiosity, particularly with this narrative of international consolidation of memory and of Jewishness as a site for dissidents. We'll be hosting Ben Nathan's later on.
Oh, yeah.
Dissident.
Sure.
But sort of the story that you're telling got me thinking about the Lubavitchers. Because I think it's so interesting to hear about the framing of the memorialization of the Holocaust and Jewish identity as the politicization of it. And I was curious about whether I was curious if you could tell us more about the channels of transmission.
Yeah.
Between the Soviet spaces
Mhm.
and the international Jewry that you're discussing.
Yeah.
It struck me that in your talk, you refer to these New York Times articles.
Mhm,
And not
mhm.
post them,
How's it
but
actually-
Also,
Yeah.
these really important
Mhm.
person to person
Mhm.
connections
Absolutely.
that are happening, and I just know a little bit.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
volunteers were pretty involved in that.
Yeah.
I wonder if they
Yeah.
during your talk.
Yeah.
And then if you could just speak more about those channels of transmission.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because it's such an important part of this story, but it's also so kind of complicated and introduces all these other
I
let's-
love
directions.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would say, so a couple of points. So in terms of the channels of transmission, the Israelis were actually much more involved in the background than has been generally understood.
Interesting.
There's some scholarship that kind of deals with this question, but they were very much, they were very interested in fomenting an immigration movement in the Soviet Union that would bring Soviet Jews to Israel. They also understood that they had to be very careful politically in their interactions with the Soviets, and that actually they didn't have that much cultural capital to trade, but who did were the Americans. And so they actually did some significant, and this is something I worked on this summer, which was fascinating, some significant kind of back channel, backroom lobbying to raise American consciousness about this issue, not just as a kind of this happened then, but to make actually that explicit connection, like, and therefore we have to do something now. And there wasn't really some sense of, at that point, for American Jews, that the people who were in the Soviet Union were their brothers, right? And that they needed to be saved. That actually had to be narrated for them. And it becomes narrated, and it actually is very effective, but it actually took about 10 years. From the end, to kind of begin slowly in the end of the 50s, but it really is like at the end of the 60s that you start this. And then once you have this social movement mobilize, the Safe Soviet Jewry movement, that begins to blow up. And that becomes a major, major point of transmission, actually something that's here at the Center for Jewish History. They have this giant archive. And there, that's really more in the 70s. And so there you have American tourists very deliberately going to the USSR with, you know, various kind of Jewish and Zionist paraphernalia and delivering messages back and forth and doing, you know, very, very consciously doing activist work. And what was one of my favorite finds, and this is, again, it's in the 70s, so it's something I deal with later, is the KGB, of course, is aware that there are tourists coming to Babyn Yar, wanting to come to Babyn Yar, and they're also aware that they can't really prevent them because now it's this kind of, you know, not so comme il faut, and we have to kind of be careful. So they starts doing all these antics, you know, like rerouting their tour buses or like, you know, just kind of like on the day of the anniversary. Like, so they're kind of okay with them like kind of being around sometimes, but they really like want them to not be meeting Soviet Jewish activists in this space. And there's a report, so there's this this KGB report, I believe from 75, where they talk about, you know, naming American tourists that are there, they're gonna come, they wanna come and they wanna connect with activists, with Jewish activists in Kyiv. And there's an embassy official and he's gonna come and he's such and such, and he actually works for the CIA. And, you know, they say this, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of course, like interested. So I looked them up and these tourists had to file their own reports when they came home. And I found the report of the tourists that they're talking about, this woman by the name of Margot Champagne. And she writes about her experience trying to connect with these people in Kyiv, right? And the accounts, right, on the KGB side, they're like, oh, we did prophylactic work, so like everything's fine, right? And on her side, she says, I tried to meet with this family several times, the meetings kept getting disrupted, but then we finally settled on a date and I came there and I was waiting for him. His wife, with his wife, and then he doesn't show up. He was supposed to come at 7, but he doesn't come till 11. And it turns out that the KGB had picked him up on the way home from work, took him like 40 kilometers out of the city, beat him up, and just left him there so that he wouldn't be able to make this meeting, right? So the KGB is like prophylactic measures, right? And she's kind of reporting this very concrete set of practices that are happening. So that was, so there are very real points of transmission. The other figure that they name, I don't have his name right now, but when I was doing research into who he was, there was an article when he died, that in his obituary, they called him Mr. X. And he was in the New York Times, and he was, in fact, this kind of, the State Department's go-to guy. Was who in the Soviet Union, and the kind of had a filing cabinet, and anyone who was in power would go to him and say who's this obcom person or whatever, what do we need to know? So he was in fact gathering intelligence, right? That was what he did. So they're kind of looking, looking at all, and then to the point of Lubavitchers, this was actually something I was really not aware of until I got in the SBU archives. Because of course their commitment to religious freedom, locks them into a situation where they have to allow certain religious kind of contact. I don't know, I just don't know enough yet to know how important that was relative to tourists, for example, which was really important. And that's something I definitely want to look at more. Unfortunately, the materials are in the SBU archive in Kyiv, and for now, that is off the.
No, I just want to know more about Schneerson, because he went back and forth and
Who?
Schneerson.
Oh, Schneerson, yes.
Who went back and
Yes.
forth in ways that you wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, no, and that's what's so interesting, and they kind of will give them some leeway, they'll allow them to do Holocaust commemoration activity and go to villages, but then there's they try to kind of contain it always.
There's a lot more that I want to talk to you about, but I will hand it over. I will just say this also helps me understand, when I was a child, I found my parents' copy of Yeltsin Shepard's Babyn Yar.
Yeah.
That's one of the first things I ever read about the Holocaust, because they had this book.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. I used to be a postdoc here. So my question is, how is this a narrative or image of Babyn Yar as site of minority rights protest movement in 1960s is at all related to the legacy of Babyn Yar in public memory from the times long before the Second World War, and everything that Babyn Yar meant to people who might not be very closely related to Holocaust victims.
What do you mean before the Second World War?
It is a side of the Holodomor.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
It is a side of Orthodox nuns persecution during October Revolution. And so when you mentioned it, just you mentioned that yes, it's kind of common knowledge that Ukrainians and Jews were not likely, I don't know.
Well, so says the KGB.
Yeah, exactly. I get the sentiment there. It just, as you were talking about it and about non-Jews attending all of those events, I'm just was there anything at all in KGB reports about Ukrainian nationalism or reasons why these people might be there that is not related to Holocaust legacy? Because it just seems so obvious that they were doing this not exclusively for strategic reasons, but also
of course,
I'm just trying to understand what was there in addition to basically Jews trying to promote their right to migrate to Israel at that point.
Well, initially it wasn't about them migrating to Israel, it became that. In terms of the site before the actual occupation period, I haven't come across anything that mentions something that happened on that site in particular. That being said, I think there were there was absolutely an acknowledgement that it wasn't just the Jewish population who died there. The issue for the people that were gathering there was that, you know, they had been the ones, the Jewish population was the one that had to, you know, got a little newspaper announcement that they had to show up there, and nobody ever talked about them. So it was acknowledged as a site of a mass atrocity, and it was acknowledged as a site of, you know, of 100,000.
No,
dead.
I'm asking about like KGB reports specifically, you know, like making all these pictures
Yeah.
of people on site
Yeah.
and trying to make the claim that these are not just like Jews who have to be persecuted in anti-Semitic Soviet society, but
Yeah.
also everybody else.
Well, they're trying to keep it to the Jews, and in
Oh.
fact, that's what I was kind of saying. So actually, the first meeting on September 24th, when it's just this kind of small group of Jewish people who gather there, they're not that interested in it. They become interested in it when it becomes a mass event where there's other people, because then it becomes a conversation where there are kind of horizontal affinities being built and solidarities being built, and that's what they're concerned about. So they have this very cynical framing about it, right, where they're like, oh, you know, they're just trying to use the fact that the Jews have managed to kind of get this capital among the diaspora, but really what they're concerned about, and again, I don't talk about it in this talk, but they published 4 manuals for how to deal with nationalism, and they were dedicated to Jewish nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, Latvian nationalism, and Estonian nationalism. Those were the ones that were kind of, and they talk about, you know, sometimes they forge alliances. That's what they, you know, so they're kind of like, be careful, because sometimes they forge alliances and the diasporas forge alliances, and we have to kind of make sure they don't forge these alliances. So there's kind of a lot going on there. But there isn't really a conversation of the site having about the commemorations being about something else. Right, they're more thinking about what is being, you know, who's gathering at the commemorations, at least what I've seen, you know, in the documents.
It's extremely interesting because, you know, like these days when you enter the site.
Oh,
there is
there
are this place of like
yeah,
who died
yeah,
here, and
yeah,
there is like
yeah.
everyone, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, I think because it was not spoken about for so long, and then the Jewish story became such a big story because of this, that actually there are other stories that just haven't had that narrativizing yet. But I'm thinking about, you know, my grandfather, he had a girlfriend who was Ukrainian, and her father was killed at Babyn Yar, and they were Ukrainian, they were killed as Ukrainian nationalists. And for some reason, before she died, she got in touch with my mom and like wrote out everything that happened, and even a map of the site and where her father was taken. But it was somehow important for her that my mom, who is Jewish, kind of register this. Not in a negative way, but kind of like that like she would witness this, right? And that she was part of this. And I found that very moving and very meaningful, and kind of something to keep thinking about, right? That like somehow there was this sense that it became that the Jewish Kyivans became the kind of not the guardians of the site, but kind of the I'm missing the word, I'll think of the word later, but custodians of the site. That's exactly right. Yeah, that sense of it.
Thank you so much for a really rich talk. I'll just piggyback on that briefly to say, it seems like that later history of how the site would continue to get reimagined with these, you know, as not being just about Jewish history, seems like a really fascinating additional part of the project they could develop. But that wasn't my question. I wanted to ask you about the poem, because I was just really struck by how central Yevtushenko's poem was in constructing the historical memory of the site internationally, it seemed. And, you know, I just wondered if this strikes you as a really common story where, you know, every historical tragedy that gets unearthed, you know, needs its poem, or is there, I mean, if you were to center the poem for a minute and you imagine you're teaching this in a class that was about the power of poetry or something, what would you say about the importance of the poem here, and why was it that, for example, internationally, there was so much attention to Yevtushenko and then to the event because there was the poem? Is it about, was it just important that there was a poem, or is it the poem itself that is, or is it just that first line kind of with its contentious statement, or just, you know, what is most interesting to you about the poem's role in that?
I mean, I think as I was doing the research, I mean, we kind of know about the poem, right? So you have, it's very, when I began working on this, very difficult to kind of think about Babyn Yar in a new way, right? So that was a really big part of this for me, was trying to understand, like, why do we think about it in this way and not other ways, and going back and kind of excavating that, right? And the poem is tremendously important. I can't think of, I mean, I don't know all examples of all poems in the world, right? But I can't think of in the Soviet case, or in the history I study, of a poem having that kind of political power. And I recognize this, especially, well, I think it did for at least 3 reasons that I can think of. One is it was not written by a Jewish person, because there were plenty of poems written by Jewish people about Babyn Yar. But 2, this was really important to Jewish people, that it was not written by a Jewish person, that it was a kind of recognition. So kind of the reverse in a way of what we were saying, right? That in a way that it was recognized by someone outside of this community as a trauma that was not just theirs. And I saw this in a really powerful way when I was looking through the archives of the Center for Jewish History over the summer, because it was referenced again and again. People would write letters to the editors of like Yiddish newspapers, right? And they would say, I read this poem, I was just so moved. They would write poems in response to the poem, American Jews, in Yiddish, in English, in Russian. You know, they would direct their poem as a direct address to Yevtushenko, right? It was like a kind of conversation or in dialogue. You know, I don't think the poem was intended as a kind of political catalyst, but I think it became a political catalyst because of the context in which it was landing, and then articulated not just that this happened, but that we have been silent about it. And this was when, and what's interesting, I guess, and this is what's valuable to me about those KGB sources, because they're from March, they're from before the poem. And they talk about that it isn't just this happened here. It was this happened and we have not spoken the truth about it, right? So he, in a way, is tapping into an already existing trauma. And that's, you know, he's not going to producing it. I think and I think if we didn't have those sources, it's just very hard to capture that, right? Because it was such a taboo. The site was a taboo, people speaking about it was a taboo. And it took this kind of catastrophic event to bring it out as a conversation that was then recorded by people who had very different interests, obviously, then. And so I do think it's tremendously important as a poem, for all of those reasons. Yeah.
So again, like everyone else, this is just incredibly fascinating. I really appreciate the talk, and I love getting another side of the 60s, which we're learning so much more about today. I can't get out of my mind the image of the bodies being washed up through in the debris and the mud and everything. And I'm wondering, I mean, mud is one thing, but disinterred remains is just such a powerful,
Mhm.
horrific image, right? And I'm just wondering if there was much in the discourse around the event that sort of catalyzed this as a major event having to do with Babyn Yar, that had to do with the disinterring of the remains of people who were massacred, who were killed, right?
Mhm.
I'm just wondering if there was much body talk.
Yeah,
Or if that, how that contributed to a sense of horror in addition to catastrophe, right?
yeah, so I think so one important part of this is actually by this point, there weren't really bodies. They had been destroyed, so there were remains,
Mhm.
but there weren't really intact bodies. They had been destroyed. and-
Oh, sure. No, I mean, I understood that, but in
Yeah.
a way that's like.
Oh, well, that was the kind of,
Or what, you know?
that, but there were the bodies also of the people who actually were killed in Kyiv.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Right,
And,
right, of
And
course.
so, and this is something I think about a lot, and I don't know how to get at it, methodologically. But I think a lot about, like, I mean, to talk about horror, right? That, Babyn Yar was there for, I mean, the city was occupied for almost 3 years, right? And it was there, like, just there with all of the things that were going on there. And people lived with that, like, day to day. And I want to understand what that felt like. I mean, just imagine like in Washington Square Park, right? Like something like that. And how unusual and powerful that is on a visceral kind of elemental level. And I haven't figured out a way to, we don't have kind of oral histories of people who were there at the time who could write about, I had to pass this. I mean, we get a little bit sometimes, when people talk about passing the site and kind of, like wanting to avoid the site and things like that. But I think that's tremendously important, actually, the materiality of it. And the fact that it was treated as a kind of almost like a taboo. That, when taboos are this very like visceral thing, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So I think in a way, the fact that it kind of brought up the, I mean, people didn't know, right, what was what, but that it did kind of open that up, I think was felt viscerally. I mean, when even that quote when they talk about don't drink the water, right? Like, I think that gets at that, like that there's the sense that, we are, or the term chalice of death, right? Which is one of the ways that it was described, I think was very evocative of that feeling of like that visceral disgust and fear.
So, so let me ask about sources then, if we have that. I mean, the KGB was really into collecting rumors.
Yeah.
And I don't know what about the occupying forces? Have you been able to do research in Nazi archives or
No,
in German archives?
and in fact, I hadn't even thought about that. To be honest, I mean, I will definitely think about that. I don't know to what degree I would like to ask somebody, a specialist, I don't know to what degree they cared about kind of the word on the street, right? The way that the KGB did, because I don't think they were planning on kind of managing that society particularly, but I don't know, I would absolutely ask, because I don't know that exists. And also I think that obviously there was also the language issue, right? Like they didn't have the kind of networks that the KGB did to be able to collect data. But I don't know. I do not know. And I will absolutely try to know. Sure, yeah.
Yes, you did mention, maybe a question that doesn't go anywhere, but what was the effect of Raphael Lemkin's work on genocide in those events that you described? Because in his writings, he first spoke about Ukrainian famine as an example of that.
Yeah.
And
Well, and the Armenian genocide was his kind of.
and Armenian genocide as well. and he participated in the diaspora gatherings here in New York. He took part, so I assume KGB knew about that cooperation, but what did the Ukrainians outside of KGB know about the concept of genocide and when those events took place?
I wish I don't know. I did not encounter his work at all. And I mean, I've encountered his work in my own work, but I did not encounter it in the sources. And even the category of genocide was not used. Atrocity was not genocide. You know, there's a whole other literature, and again, I was working, the reason I kind of began this, the reason I even turned to this at all, this was not going to be a project about Babyn Yar. But the reason that I even became interested in it is because of my project on the Wall of Memory. And when I came to the end, kind of spoiler alert of the book, when I came to the end, one of the reasons that the KGB was kind of circulating was they believed that even if the artist didn't intend this, that it was being read as a memorial to Babyn Yar through the back door. And there's, you know, the way they talk about it, they're like, they made a wailing wall, they made, you know, that it would be a place where, you know, Jews would go to, you know, have, because they didn't recognize the official memorial, which was created in 76. So I kind of began, I was like, why, okay, but if you thought that, why didn't you think that in 67, when you looked at the initial report, why didn't you think about it, you know, in 69, when you approved their sketches? Like, it just didn't make sense to me why this issue that they identified was important to them in 1981, but not important to them in 1967, right? Enough to actually go and destroy the thing. So for me, it was really thinking about Babyn Yar as this kind of politically salient issue, but it's not really a project for me about Babyn Yar. It's not a history of Babyn Yar and of what happened there. It's a history of how it came to be this kind of something that could be politically converted into other, you know, other agendas, let's say.
We have a comment on Zoom. I can give you the.
Okay. Hang on,
Touch screen.
sorry. It's okay. I can read it. Yeah, once you read it.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So we have a comment on Zoom from Valeria Sopin. Thanks so much for your rich talk. I used to live in the Siritz neighborhood, so this is literally close to home and so meaningful. I have to leave now, but I just wanted to give credit to Mykola Bazhan, who wrote a very powerful poem in Ukrainian about Babyn Yar back in 1943, and it's now available in English. It didn't explicitly address Jewish victimhood, but it ends with the lines, "Cursed be he who will be tempted to forget. Cursed be he who will tell us forgive." That poem didn't have the same resonance as Yevtushenko's, of course, for obvious reasons, including the time and the language, but I just wanted to mention it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liara. I'll convey our thanks to Liara.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
And I should say that the Curie book, Ukrainian Poets Respond to Babyn Yar, is an incredible resource, which covers, including, it has Bazhan's poem, and that's in terms of sources, that's actually one of the few ways to get at how people felt at the time about it, because there's so little that remains. So it's actually a really tremendous and you know, valuable source. So thank you.
Brandon Schechter, Blavatnik Archive. As you know, we're doing this large refusing and activist thing, which includes digitized versions of a lot of Samizdat and also a lot of the trip reports, similar to what you're looking at from HHS. My question is about, from this work and from Sam Finkelman's work about Samizdat, it really is quite counterintuitive the extent to which Ukrainian nationalists and Jewish refuseniks, or the Free Soviet Jewish movement at large, are interacting with each other, supporting each other, And I'm just wondering about KGB attempts to basically, rend that asunder. I'm wondering about,
Yeah.
also once, leaving is an option for Jews, it's not really an option for
Yeah.
nationalists.
Yeah,
So I'm just wondering with both, probably more so with the book than with Babyn Yar project, how does that play out in the long term and what kind of, what anecdotes can you tell us that you find in the archives about this?
I mean, they were deeply committed to undermining to that relationship. And the best way that they had of doing that was releasing information about Ukrainian collaborators. So whenever there would be a kind of sense that things were, that a dialogue was happening and some kind of solidarities were forming, there would be some huge expose about, collaborators and, that would, in a way, fray out. There was I don't have it in front of me, but in 1966, there was a kind of an attempt to have this Ukrainian Jewish dialogue actually in New York. And there's a kind of report of it, and like they couldn't come to I guess a relationship both sides felt was productive. But I'm sure that there was a lot of effort put into making that the case. So they were very, very, in general, I think the KGB, it's really hard to work with these sources because they're just so deeply cynical. And it's really, it's a world that you don't want to live in, like reading their interpretations, But I think they were above all interested, in sowing discord and kind of disinformation. They were constantly creating kind of minor scandals among the refuseniks. They were kind of playing them off each other. They were trying to, tell them that who was sleeping with whom, this kind of stuff, like from the pettiest thing all the way to, releasing some kind of big expose about collaboration. So, I think for them, the priority was precisely to prevent horizontal affinities, right, in Soviet society, right? That was the threat. And actually, especially when those had political weight abroad, right, that could then be, kind of amplified. So, which is why their reading of Zuba's speech is so like hair raising, right? Because you're like, why would this be your interpretation of the story, right? But that's how, that was the logic, right? That was their logic, was like, somebody is trying to convert something to some other end that is not what they say it is, right? It's some other instrument.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.